Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're talking about 1 Timothy 5, and specifically, this is the Widows chapter. Oh, a slightly controversial chapter depending on what branch of Christianity, or Christendom, as some people call it, that you find yourself in. It shouldn't be that difficult. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in what it says, but a lot of people take issue with this for some reason, and, well, for other reasons, such as the whole institutional movement, a lot of people just get way backwards on this, and it's not very helpful. So, if you remember where we were at, I say last week, for me it was about 30 seconds ago, we were in 1 Timothy 4, and the idea is there, talking about what the evangelist is supposed to do, and a preacher, and Timothy, you specifically, what are some of your particular roles? That is a very helpful chapter because it lets preachers know that there's a position for preachers. It lets preachers know what they should be doing, and it helps guide us when we maybe don't know exactly what to do. But it also gives the congregation and people who read that, it gives them resources by which they can evaluate the preacher, a preacher or evangelist at a local congregation, and ask if they're actually fulfilling the work that they're supposed to be doing, or if they're just kind of churning out lessons but aren't really being an example and the lessons aren't really about the good doctrine. They're just kind of very surface level churchy stuff that doesn't really deal with the Word of God at all, and they don't give attention to the public reading of Scripture and all these different things. It's a little bit of a rubric by which you can grade how well someone is doing. So hopefully that's useful for that. But that was last week, and this is this week. We're dealing with 1 Timothy 5, which means we should get started talking about widows. 1 Timothy 5 in verses 1 through 4, it's starting into this new section, and so it's defining something else, but then we'll pull around in verses 3 and 4 and hit the widow's question and start down the track. Chapter 5 and verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger as sisters with all purity. Honor widows who are really widows, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Timothy was just told at the end of 1 Timothy 4 to watch yourself and the doctrine and continue in them, for in doing so you're going to save yourself and those who hear you. For someone who is continuing in the doctrine, sometimes you'll run across older men and older women and younger women, and they don't really understand what they're talking about, and they don't understand the doctrine. They're not following after the actual words of God. They're following something else, and there can be a tendency to kind of snap at them and to say, well, you're just an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. As much as that is a tendency especially for Timothy, who is himself a younger man, be careful. Do not rebuke, but exhort. And it says don't rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. Some people think it's just don't rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. And the younger men, you can rebuke them, and you don't have to exhort them. And the older women, you can rebuke them, and you don't have to exhort them. I am of the mindset that the don't rebuke, but exhort is probably setting a pattern precedent for the younger men and the older women and the younger women as well. Paul is saying, don't just destroy someone. Don't just turn around and lash out and try to, ruin somebody's relationship with God, but encourage him. Be careful with how you approach people. It's very easy to say, I have the right doctrine, you have the wrong doctrine, you need to shut up and learn. It's often not very helpful. So, don't just rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, as a family member. Go to him like you would go to your dad. If you treat your dad badly, maybe go to him like you believe you probably should go to your dad instead of how you actually do. But the same is true for brothers and sisters and mothers and such like that. Do your best to help people instead of just destroying them. There's also this phrase, with all purity, in the end of verse 2. And many people seem to believe Chapter 2, treat the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. There are a lot of people who think that the purity there is a reference to, and we saw the same thing in the last chapter, they think the purity in verse 2 is a reference to sexual purity, particularly when dealing with the younger women. Timothy is called a younger man, and so maybe that's true. I mean, it's certainly true that you should be sexually pure with anyone who's around, especially for young men, especially younger women. That can be a great temptation. At the same time, I really don't think that's what Paul is talking about. It's a true principle. I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here. I think the purity is the kind of blanket umbrella term that's being applied to interactions with everyone. If you remember back in chapter 1, let's see, where is this? Back in chapter 1, it's talking about how the goal of our instruction is love. Where is it? There we are. Chapter 1 and verse 5. The purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. And those are the three, from which some, having strayed, have gone into idle talk, which is worthless, and they're doing a bunch of things to tear people down. But purity in the First Timothy, in the book of First Timothy, purity seems to be a not necessarily like a sexual purity, as in don't engage in adulterous actions, but it seems to be a statement of your heart's intention. And when you rebuke an older man, are you doing it just because you want to be right, or are you doing it because you want him to be righteous before God? Do I have a pure heart? Do I have a pure intention? Is there a good reason why I'm doing that? Or do I just want to tell people that they're wrong and I'm actually smarter than they are because I know what the truth is and they don't because they're pretty stupid? That's not going to be helpful or righteous or beneficial. Do not rebuke, but exhort with all purity. I should probably highlight with all purity. I'll actually go and do that, and then I'll be right back. And there you go. Don't rebuke, but exhort with all purity. That's the idea of those introductory couple of verses. Now, there is a specific thing that needs to be addressed when you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with other people, and especially older people. You may run into some older people who are interesting, in an interesting mode of life. Not that the people themselves are interesting, I'm sure that they are, but that there are many unfortunate circumstances, which mean sometimes somebody gets married and then eventually the spouse dies. Probably both of them don't die at the same time, and that means one of them is left while the other one has moved on and is hopefully in heaven, but, that depends on who the person was. Honor widows. That's really important. That's a lesson the church learned pretty quickly in Acts chapters 6 and 7, with the whole Stephen and or appointing the first maybe so-called deacons. I don't know. I kind of take that view, but a lot of other people don't, so I don't really care. With that whole debacle, what was happening was in Acts chapter 6, the Hellenistic or Jewish widows, but they had a very strong Greek background, so a lot of Jews kind of disassociated with them because they were kind of half Gentiles because their culture and their language was very Greek instead of being Jewish, and the Jews were offended by that. The Hellenistic widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food, which is to say the church was not really providing for them. And they needed to fix that because there are widows who are really widows, and the church should step in and help them. However, there are going to be several different qualifications by which a widow is qualified or disqualified from being supported by the church. There are whole branches of Christianity, or versions of Christianity, which I am from what people would say is a very conservative branch of Christianity. I would just say I'm from the ones that, read the Bible and try to do it, but different people would disagree, or different people would take broader views of some of the things that the Bible says. In particular, there was a break in around the 80s, I think it was, a little before my time, personally, but there was a break between what's called the institutional movement and the congregational or non-institutional movement between different churches of Christ is usually what the title is that we go by. One of the driving issues, there are several driving issues. Basically, to summarize a lot that really shouldn't be summarized to this level, but I'm going to do it anyway. To summarize a lot of the disagreement, institutional churches believe that you can use, that the church should donate to and help human institutions to serve physical needs in the world, whereas non-institutional or congregational churches don't believe that churches should be donating to human institutions to do physical good in the world. They believe that every individual has a responsibility to go out and do good in the world, but it's not the church's job to donate money on the behalf of the individual. It's the individual's job to actually take responsibility and do what's right. That's the side that I fall on. Different people have different opinions. You're probably wrong. That's the side that I fall on. I'm pretty sure it's the right one, but there are a lot of minutia and stuff crops up all over the New Testament. The reason I'm bringing that up here, and the reason that I am summarizing so much here, is because one of the debates that is often had between institutional churches and congregational churches, or just it's a break with most of the like Baptist, Methodist, etc. churches, versions of church throughout the world, are a lot of those churches like to do a lot to help widows, like they'll donate to, orphans homes and widows shelters, and they'll make sure that those people are provided for. That's something that is good. It's good to, visit the orphans and the widows. That's true religion in James chapter 1. However, there's a reason widows have to meet certain qualifications before the church steps in to help them. And if the church just kind of blanketly donates to an organization or a cause that helps widows, you're not actually following the commands of 1 Timothy 5, which is one of the reasons, not far from the only one, but one of the reasons why institutional doesn't really do it for me. It's not actually what God said. Honor widows who are truly widows, or really widows. What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, here we go. A widow is, by definition, is someone who has lost her husband. You could argue this is about widowers as well, someone who has lost his wife. That I don't believe that holds true. Some people will argue this is about widows and widowers. It's anyone who's lost a spouse. I don't think that's correct. This is about widows. This is about women who have lost a spouse. And by the way, when people say that Paul hated women, he never writes anything about widowers being provided for. No, men just have to work into our old age to provide for ourselves. Women are, in some cases, able to be provided for by the church. Think about how much Paul hates women, that he makes men work a lot more, and he gives women the opportunity to not have to work in a secular way to provide for themselves in that way. Think about how unbalanced that is, and how much more is put on men, and then try telling me that Paul is just a sexist and hates women and all those things that people say about chapter 2. I don't think people who make those claims have actually read the books that Paul wrote on behalf of God. But that's a whole different issue. We're talking about widows, women, older women who can be provided for in some instances by the church when their husband dies. Here are some qualifications, though. If you have children or grandchildren, if you have children or grandchildren, you're not really a widow, because the idea of being a widow is not merely that the base level of being a widow is that your husband has died, your husband has died. But it's not just, hey, if your husband dies, then you can get provided for by the church. If you are 20 years old and then your husband dies, we're going to talk about it, but no, you can just remarry. You have plenty of life left to live. Why do you think the church would provide for you at some point just because your husband died? There's something else going on here. That's why verse 3 is very specific. Honor widows who are really widows, as in there's no one left to provide for them. It's not merely that the husband is dead, it's that their family isn't around or isn't able to take care of them, or they just don't have any family who's capable or willing or able to do it. If a widow has children or grandchildren, verse 4, let them first learn to show piety at home and repay their parents. That's good and acceptable before God. If a widow has family members who could provide for her, but who aren't, that's not necessarily the church's job to step in and fix. The church providing for widows is providing for people who don't have any children or grandchildren or husband anymore and has no other living human relative who can take care of them. That's the first kind of definition of widow. There are a lot of widows who have children who just decide not to support them. There's an argument to be made that if the child decides not to support them, the church should step in and do as best it can to help the person. I'm not sure I buy that, because Paul doesn't seem to allow that, unless there's something in the next few verses that I forgot about. But to figure that out, we'll have to go ahead and pan over to the next slide. Widows who are widows indeed. Verse 5, now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. She who is really a widow and left alone, well, this is the term that we're trying to define. What does it mean to be left alone, and what does a real faithful widow look like? You're looking for not just a person whose husband has died and whose children have died, but someone who is fulfilling all these different things. Someone who is all by herself. She's left alone. Someone who trusts in God. If she's left alone but doesn't really trust in God, not really a widow, not a true widow who is still dedicated to God, not according to God's standards. If she continues in supplications and prayers night and day, that's great. But if this is a widow who trusts in God but doesn't really pray very much, well, okay, I'm not going to count her either. If she's not willing to have a dialogue with God, if she's not willing to work as best she can, if she's not willing to be of spiritual benefit to the congregation, then the congregation's not going to be of physical benefit to her. If she doesn't continue in supplications and prayers, the congregation's not going to help out physically. And again, some people read this and say, well, that doesn't seem very nice to the women, right? It's just a widow. She needs help. Okay. But widowers don't get any of these options at all. And so, again, yeah, it may be a strict list, it may be a strict set of requirements to get on the widow's list, but men can't get on the widow's list at all. And so, again, it's not unfair or it's not like unfair and hateful towards women. If anything, it's unfair and hateful towards men. A woman, a widow, needs to actually be faithful to God and needs to be expressing that, needs to be working. These things command, verse 6, if she lives in pleasure, right, if she's living an extravagant lifestyle, if she's living for herself, if there's selfishness, if she's just doing what she wants to, or if she's, spending a bunch of money on stuff that's irrelevant or doesn't matter or irreverent or against God entirely, no. The church is not going to fund something like that. If she's living outside of her means, that's her problem, and she doesn't get to call up the church to, plaster over the wall that she messed up. These things command that they may be blameless. Verse 7, the same kind of qualification for an elder or a deacon. Again, the word blameless technically means innocent, and there is zero qualification on that. That means absolutely innocent, and no one could ever say anything bad about them. Of course, that's not going to be exactly true, but you understand the concept of what it means to be generally blameless. And and then there are several more qualifications that come down later. There is an age limit on this. In verse 9, 60 years old. If a widow's younger than 60 years old, don't take her in. Some people have a question on this. In the modern day, should it still be 60 years old? It's kind of the age of retirement. In the old world, a lot of people would live into their 50s and then die, and so people hitting 60 years old is kind of a rarity. And oftentimes this is compared to, or oftentimes in conversations that I've had, this is compared to like the age of Social Security, where originally it was meant to provide for someone if they happened to make it that long, understanding most people didn't make it that long. But nowadays, with medical intervention and all sorts of different things, nowadays, you can extend your life a lot longer than that, and so people are living longer than they ever have. In that case, should we move up the age for widowers until it's, don't let a widow under 70 years old to kind of approximate the time scale? I don't think so. I think the age is fine. 60 is fine. I'm not one to change that age, but also, in a lot of instances with Social Security and stuff like that, a lot of women, a lot of even widows who make it up in that direction don't need as much or don't need help from the church at all because they're already being provided for. And so in those instances, it kind of cancels each other out, and we end up in a pretty balanced situation anyway. Don't let a widow under 60 years old be taken into number. Basically, make sure that, a widow is old. Make sure that she's actually old. If she's young, well, no, don't do that. And not unless she has been the wife of one man. You can't be a widow without being the wife. But again, it's that one man concept. A woman of one man, like a man of one woman, from the eldership in 1 Timothy chapter 3. The more you read about widows, the more you realize this is kind of like being it's not like being a woman elder. That's totally the wrong way to put it. But a lot of these qualifications strangely mirror the eldership qualifications from chapter 3. Of course, it's not the position of leadership or anything like that, but it is very much a kind of version of that. Don't let the elder be a novice. Don't let a widow on the list unless she is over a certain age. She needs to have been the wife of one man, like an elder needs to be the wife of one woman. They both need to be blameless. They both need to be well reported for good works. And then here are some examples of the good works. Brought up children, lodged strangers, washed the saints' feet, relieved the afflicted, and diligently followed every good work, just doing some good things. Some people believe that means that that is like a list, a check mark list that widows need to have crossed off, which means if there is a widow who has never had children, and then she says, well, my husband has died and I don't have any children to take care of me, some people say, well, since she hasn't brought up children, she doesn't make the list. I'm not sure that I personally agree with that, but I'm not sure that I don't agree with that. I'm not really convinced either way on verse 10. I think the main point of verse 10 is you need to be well reported for good works. Examples being bringing up children is a good work, or lodging strangers is a good work, or washing the saints' feet is a good work, or relieving the afflicted is a good work. Those things are examples. I'm not sure that you have to do every single one of them to be on the list, but I do know they are good examples. And so I am probably inclined that if she hasn't brought up children, well, depending on the circumstance, a lot of times, in some instances, that is the woman's own fault. In some instances, that's just your life wasn't able to go there, right? You are married late, and then the having a kid doesn't work, or whatever the reason is, you just don't end up having a kid. I know people who got married past the age of childbearing, and then you're not really able to bring up children in that circumstance. And so I'm not committed to either particular interpretation, but it is curious and something that we could debate if that ever came into question. That's the point for widows, right? They have to fulfill all of these things. Basically, you need to be a solid spiritual woman who doesn't have a husband or son who's able to work and provide for her. Especially in those old days, the security net, they didn't have Social Security. If you you would have to work for yourself, or you would have to have somebody else work and pay to support you. So if a woman has a husband, well, the husband can support the woman. If her husband dies, well, her child can support the woman. And if she doesn't have any children, well, then maybe the church can help the women out in those extreme circumstances. Yes, it is kind of rare, I think, for a widow to actually make it on the list. The institutional movement and many other churches would just pay a bunch of money towards widows' homes to try and help them out. Okay, it's a nice gesture, but that's not what Paul said. That's not what God said about providing for widows. Sure, provide for them out of your own pocket, be a benefit to them. If someone doesn't provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's physically true, right? If a son doesn't provide for his mom, then you're a horrific son, but that's also otherwise true. If I see a widow suffering and I'm able to help her out, well, if I refuse to help her out, what kind of person am I? That's awful. But at the same time, that's true from an individual level, and the church takes over when the individuals cannot, or when there are no individuals to be able to help. Basically, the point of this is you don't want to burden the church, and that's even going to be said later on in verse 16. The church, really, you're supposed to be focusing on the spiritual things, not the physical things. So for all those churches who are obsessed with providing for physical needs, maybe reevaluate and take a look at 1 Timothy 5, because again, 1 Timothy 5 verse 16, we'll get there in a minute, is don't let the church be burdened. That's not really the point of the church. You do have this idea in verse 8, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. If you are a child who has a parent in need, take care of your parent, especially your mother, but take care of your parent, because otherwise God will not think very highly of you. We read that widows need to be over 60 years old, right? Or 60-year-old or over. They can't be under 60 years old, right? You have to be equal to or greater than 60 years old. Why not the younger ones? Well, Paul even decides to explain that here in verses 11 through 16. I'll go ahead and read those, and this is the last word on widows, at least for the moment. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation, because they've cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Again, focus on the section is the younger widows. Let them get married. If you get married at, in those days, 16, and then your husband dies in a battle when he's 18, that's unfortunate. But you have a lot of time where you can get married again, and you can bear children for your own family, and you could take care of your own family, and you could do all these sorts of things. You have plenty of time to, live a normal lifestyle that you should be using to do so. If someone is a widow and their husband dies at 20, well, you can't just go to the church and say, well, I'm a widow, nobody's around to provide for me. I mean, you can go to the church and say that, but the church shouldn't provide for that. No, you have the ability to work. You have the ability to go provide for yourself. Why are you trying to burden the church of God when the church has actual important things to be doing instead of taking care of you, especially while you're young? And there are plenty of reasons for that. When they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry and all these other things. They have condemnation, they've cast off their faith, and they learn, especially if the church were to just provide for every 25-year-old whose husband has died, well, then you don't have to do anything, and then you can just sit around your house all day, and then you don't ever have to learn to work and learn to be diligent and learn to, level up as a human. You don't have to take care of children. You don't have to manage the house. If the church is just going to provide your payroll for everything, well, you just get to be lazy. That's not acceptable. No, the church is not here to inspire laziness. The church is to take care of people of specifically the widows who very much cannot provide for themselves in a very physical way, to make sure that they are taken care of in their last couple or few years of life. The church is not supposed to just hand out free money to anyone who asks because it is convenient. If you're a younger widow, you've evidently shown that you want to get married and bear children and manage the house, so do it. I mean, there's no reason not to do it. Go and live diligently. That's what God is wanting. Again, verse 16, the point is, if you have widows, if you are someone who's a Christian and you do have a widow in your family that needs taking care of, make sure that you take care of them. Don't just shove that off on the church. The church is not a bunch of resources for you to just hand people to so that the church solves everything. No, that's not what the church is for. The church is for spiritual encouragement and building up, and the church is also to help those who really, really desperately need it who are widows and who are living righteously and who have shown to be an example to God or for God for a long amount of time, who are trying to live righteously. One of the modern day problems we have, and one of the reasons why movements in churches like the institutional movement or others are so popular, is because it's really easy to say, well, there's this homeless person who needs some food, and let me send them to the church, and the church can give them food. I don't think that's not what the church is for, right? The church is not for providing all these physical needs for random people. Christians are the ones who look at somebody who needs food and says, hey, let me go get you some food. The church should not be... A lot of people use churches to pawn off their personal responsibility. It is, we need to make sure that people are looked after. We need to feed the hungry. If somebody is hungry and asks for food, we need to be the ones who feed them. A lot of people just hand that to the church, and they hand the church address, and the church has a soup kitchen or whatever that serves people, and they think they've done their job. You haven't actually fed the hungry. You pointed them somewhere else for somebody else to feed them. The church, we as individuals need to take care of orphans and widows. Well, if we just give money to the church, then the church can pay the orphan's home or the widow's home or whatever it is, and the church can pay to provide for them, and since I paid the church a little bit, it's basically me taking care of them. But no, it's not. You have decided to shirk your responsibility and tell the church to take care of it for you, and you have basically just tried to pay the church to do the work of being a Christian for you, and that's not how the church works. That's not what the church is. The church is a collection of saved people. The church is not an organization that you can pay to do your righteousness vicariously for you. When somebody says the goal of Christians is to go out and preach the gospel to the world, a lot of churches are what are called missionary societies, which is basically where a bunch of churches pay some group to send out missionaries to go preach the gospel in other parts of the world. There's a tendency for me to donate to a church, for that church to donate to a society, and then me to say, well, look, I'm helping preach the gospel because I'm paying someone else to pay someone else to go and preach the gospel. But that's not you preaching the gospel now, is it? You're avoiding your responsibility by paying the church to do it for you. And if that's your attitude about what the church is and how the church should be, you clearly don't understand the line in verse 16, which is, don't burden the church. It's not about all this physical stuff. If God wanted churches to be about collecting money to give the money to other organizations for those organizations to do good, he would have said something about it. Instead, God wants people to do good and people to also be part of the church. And as individual Christians, we have responsibilities. The church, the congregation that we assemble with locally does not have the same responsibilities that we as individuals do. And we need to make the clear distinction because it's a very clear distinction to be made. That's one of the reasons why I'm against a lot of these institutional or other movements that are all about Christianity feeding people or giving them shelter or taking care of orphans and widows. Those are all good things to do, but those are things that I am responsible for individually, and I can't just pay the church to go and do my stuff for me. I can't pay someone to be righteous and have it credited to my account. I'm not going to be able to pay the church to do what's good and have that act as if I've done anything good either. That's the whole widow's question, and hopefully there's a pretty good summation as to why some of those things are said and what they mean, and then eventually what you actually do with those in turn. At the end of this chapter, you have a few different thoughts that are brought in as well. Not about widows anymore, but since we're talking about things that are elder adjacent, some of those qualifications being very, very similar, let's go ahead and talk about elders again. Let's mention another fact about them. Verses 17 through 21 of chapter 5. This is, this is not the rest of the chapter, but it's another step down the process. Verse 17, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. Talking about elders, we're talking about elders specifically who rule well. The elders are going to be the ones in charge of who gets put on the widow's list and who doesn't. And so, kind of a natural segue would be, well, okay, now that I'm thinking about the elders, well, let them be counted worthy of double honor. Those who rule well, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, don't muzzle the ox while he is threshing, right, when he treads out the grain. In other words, if the ox is doing your work for you and working on your grain, don't take away his food source. Let him eat some of the grain that he works on, because that's fair. Or the laborer is worthy of his wages. If somebody is working, then yeah, he deserves to be paid, so pay him for his service. The elders who rule well, and that concept of double honor is generally, from what I've heard, it's not just the idea of honoring someone who's an elder by saying, hey, I appreciate that you're an elder. That's pretty cool. But also the double honor portion of it is, I appreciate that you're an elder, and you can pay elders monetarily. A lot of churches don't do this. We have, in the modern scenario where most people have some form of social security, at least in America, there's less of a need to actually pay some of these older people, but the elders who rule well and who are doing it, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine, who are devoting themselves to preaching and teaching and providing spiritual leadership, well, if they're benefiting you spiritually, then you can benefit them physically. And there's nothing wrong with paying elders. A lot of situations don't require elders to be paid. That's fine. Nothing says you have to pay elders. But also, in some situations, you are able to pay elders, especially those who are teaching and preaching and putting forth all that effort. You can. That's perfectly justified. Some churches are outright against paying elders. I don't really know why. It's not good motivation for a man to become an elder just for the money, but it is. Hey, if you have an elder, especially one who's working hard, don't feel bad about paying him, right? The laborer is worthy of his wages. That's something that he works for. That's something that he can get. That's an honor that is, and a respect that he is afforded. There's also another level of respect. It's not just the money that's a potential version of respect, but it's also basically verse 19. Remember, an elder is supposed to be blameless. That doesn't mean the elder is actually going to be perfectly blameless or innocent. People are going to come up with words against the elders, and they'll say a thing or two and have their complaints. That's great, right? That's sarcasm, right? It's not actually great, but that's going to happen. People are going to have complaints against the elders, and a lot of times, even though the preacher is not the elder, even though the preacher is not an elder, the word pastor means elder, not preacher, but a lot of people, because Baptists and various other groups have conflated the terms. A lot of people are very confused about that, but make no mistake, we are not the same. A preacher is about preaching and teaching primarily, and the elder is about leading the congregation, which can include preaching and teaching, like it says in verse 17, but that's not exclusively it. In many ways, that's not even the main focus of it. That's why it's significant if an elder also labors in the word and doctrine and does the preaching and teaching thing. One of the benefits of being an elder, when you are blameless, not exactly blameless, not perfectly blameless, not innocent of any wrongdoing ever, right? We understand that. But when you are generally blameless, when you've been through that test and that questioning process, and people are saying, yeah, nope, he's a pretty solid guy, that means you are afforded a degree of protection against people. And if somebody random comes up and starts to spread malicious accusations against an elder, especially if they go and try to tell it to the preacher, hey, preacher, no, that's stupid. Is he blameless or not? If he's blameless, then let him be blameless. If there are 2 or 3 witnesses, if there are 5 people who come up to you and say, hey, I saw this guy have a really bad temper tantrum, and I don't know exactly what was going on. If there's one person who says that especially if your elder is aiming for blameless and actually pretty solid there, the odds are that person's just making something up and you don't need to give it the time of day. If there are 2 people who are saying that, if there are 5 people or 10 people who are saying that, if there's a whole congregation who are saying that, I saw something happen one time where an elder just kind of went off the rails in front of the whole congregation. That was not a one person accuses the elder of something and so everybody accuses the elder of something, but that was 120 people, or however many it was, just saw an elder go way unhinged. There's a problem there. And a couple weeks later, that elder stepped down, and that was probably the right decision. Don't receive an accusation, right? If the elder is doing well and being righteous and doing all these things, then if somebody comes up and has something against an elder, basically ignore it. If 2 or 3 people, or there are a bunch of witnesses who are all saying, hey, the elder has this problem, maybe there's something you need to listen to. But in many cases, it's just one person who is upset and angry at the elder or elders in question, and it's not actually a good reason to accuse them of anything or do anything to them at all. It doesn't mean never listen to an accusation, because those who are sinning, there are elders who sin, you can rebuke them in the presence of all, and they're the leaders, and they need to be held accountable for evils that they do. If one of the elders is horribly corrupt, there's a time and place to go and rebuke the elder in the presence of all so that everybody is afraid and says, oh, if one of the leaders can be called out for such a horrible thing that they're doing, I need to be righteous. There's a time and place for that. But it's not when one random person brings up an accusation that is totally unverified and may or may not be true and whatever else it is. If everybody's telling you that the elder is evil, there's something to listen to. If one person just has a personal grudge, ignore it. Correct the one person for having the personal grudge. That's more important than otherwise. Those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all. Again, there is a time and place for that, but it's not all the time, and don't just take people at their word. If a random congregation member that I don't know very well is being accused of doing something evil, maybe that's true. I don't really know them very well. It's not really my job as the preacher. You go and talk to them personally about it, all Matthew 18 style. But if somebody brings me an accusation against one of them, I'll direct you to one of them. If someone brings me an accusation against one of the elders, I don't care. Bring me 10 people who all agree on the story or on the basic idea, and then maybe you have something. But until then, he's an elder for a reason. He's afforded a greater degree of respect. That's one of the benefits of being in the eldership is you don't have to there is a degree of respect, and there is kind of a buffer to make sure you don't have to answer every single accusation that comes your way, because when you're an elder, you're going to have a lot more accusations coming your way. And Timothy, just when you hear those, ignore them. It's not worth engaging with. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels. Here's the final word on this little eldership section, or, well, it's not actually the final word. There's more in verse 22, but it's starting to close this out. You need to observe these things without prejudice and do nothing without partiality. There are every eldership I've been under, either as just a regular Christian, or before I was a Christian, or just as a regular Christian, or now that I am a preacher and I'm fulfilling those just different roles throughout time. Every eldership that I've worked under, there are elders I am more readily able to communicate with. There are elders where an elder and I think along the same wavelength. Okay, I'm very comfortable talking to that guy and expressing myself to that guy because he knows where I'm coming from. There are other elders where they're great men, but we just don't think the same way, and there are communication difficulties to try and work with other elders. There is a tendency, and this is true for an evangelist, this is true for random people in the congregation as well. If one of the elders is really personable and one of the elders is really not, people are going to develop a favorite elder, which may not be the best thing. It's not necessarily evil, but it might not be the best thing. People will develop an elder that they're comfortable talking to. In many groups, I know that sometimes there's like an elder assigned to a specific portion of the congregation, and if you need something, well, you go to your elder, and he reports it to the rest of them, and together they make the decision. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but there is a danger with that, which is to say, if my favorite elder is caught doing something bad, sometimes I'm more likely to forgive the bad thing he's doing because he's my favorite elder. And the same thing with my least favorite elder. If my least favorite elder is caught doing something bad, well, that's an opportunity to accuse him with a bunch of witnesses and get him kicked out of being an elder. If you observe these things with prejudice and partiality, God is going to observe your fate on Judgment Day with prejudice and partiality. Don't do it. I understand having a preferred elder to communicate with. That's fine. But if you allow that to get in the way of good and righteous judgment, especially, it must be said, especially as a preacher, but as just anybody, well, there are problems with that. And you can extend that principle, of course. If you allow partiality to get in the way of any righteous judgment, well, it's not righteous judgment anymore. It's just bias, and it's not good or godly. So be careful with that. Observe these things without prejudice. Make sure that you're doing what's right. That's about all I have to say on that. We'll leave that there. Eldership idea, I mean, don't just... they're afforded a degree of respect and honor beyond the level of normal Christians because they have a greater degree of responsibility and a greater degree of clear righteousness and experience than other people do. But make sure that you are not biased. Don't let elders, just because you shouldn't receive an accusation against an elder except by multiple witnesses. If 2 or 3 people come to you and say, hey, we think there is this problem, don't disagree with that, or don't just wave that away because it's your favorite elder who's being accused of something. You need to deal fairly with that. And when people mess this up, and especially when preachers mess this up, things can go poorly. Don't do anything with partiality. God is not partial. You don't be either. And so we end the chapter with verses 22 through 25. A few different things which have to deal more specifically with Timothy, but kind of it's partly Timothy's role in the eldership process, I think, at least for verse 22, but then some other things as well. And I am not the clearest on what exactly these things are here for, but I'll give you my best shot, and who knows, you can disagree with that. I don't really care. It may be educational for me. 5 and verse 22, don't lay hands on anyone hastily. Don't share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and for your frequent infirmities. Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but some of those men follow later, or those of some men follow later. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly hidden, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. Or the good works of some are clearly evident. Apparently I can't read. I've lost the ability to read at 2:27 on a Sunday afternoon. What in the world is happening here? Well, so we're dealing with the eldership question, right? We're dealing with treating elders fairly and even-handedly, not being super judgmental, but not refraining from judgment if there is actual evidence. Just make sure that you're dealing with the situation appropriately. And then he says this, don't lay hands on anyone hastily. Don't share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. And then also no longer drink a little water, but use some wine. What in the world is that about? I've got a theory, but we'll leave it for just a second. The idea of verse 22 is don't lay hands on anyone hastily. The elder appointing process in that Paul was talking about even in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Well, one of the examples we have of that is Acts chapter 13, or Acts chapter 14 would be on the way back, I think. Acts chapter 14, in verse 23. Oh, it doesn't actually say what I thought it said. Well, that's fine. They had, this is Paul and Barnabas going back through the different churches on the first missionary journey. They appointed elders in every church, and they prayed with fasting, and they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. For some reason, I thought the idea there was that they laid their hands on the people. The presbytery in chapter 4 laid their hands on Timothy to elect him to the role of evangelist. At least I believe that's what that's talking about. The eldership here, or rather, the evangelist here, Timothy, is supposed to lay hands on someone and maybe share in their sin. I think this is the idea of appointing someone to be an elder in verse 22. Don't be hasty about it, right? Timothy, and even Titus over in Titus 1 is told that he's in Crete so that he can appoint people to be elders in the churches there. Well, that seems kind of important that you do it well. You don't want to just kind of rush things. You don't want to just to make someone an elder when they shouldn't be. You don't want to be the one who does that because you're going to share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. Be careful about who you pick to be in charge because you, as the one who picked them, especially Timothy and Titus, right, evangelists in the area, you are going to be in charge of that. And so I think the application is broader. Whoever goes to appoint the eldership or new elders to a congregation, be careful who you pick because you to some extent are responsible for how they live and what they're doing, for how they lead in the church of God. If you put them there, you're partially responsible for how it goes. So be wise about it and don't rush into things. At the same time, drink some wine. What in the world is that about? I don't know. A lot of people have tried to explain this verse and mostly come to unsatisfactory conclusions. One of the things that I've heard a lot is Paul is writing this book via dictation, and this is something where he wanted to say this at the end. He wanted to say this to Timothy somewhere, and he kind of was just forgetting about it. And so in order for him not to forget about it anymore, he just kind of stuck it into chapter 5, even though it doesn't really fit. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think that's a very intelligent way to understand divine inspiration. I don't really understand what it's doing here, but my best guess is it's related to this idea of sharing in other people's sins. If you read into this a little bit, verse 23 is, don't drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Timothy has something that's going on with him medically where he actually needs some wine to let him heal or not terribly upset his stomach. Water, it was harder to get clean drinking water than it is today, right? And so a lot of times they would combine their water with a little bit of some kind of wine or alcohol because alcohol is a purifying agent, and it actually killed a bunch of the bacteria in the water and made the water safe to drink. What I would suppose is happening, and this is all hypothetical, right? But this is how I connected in, and this is what I think is going on, is Timothy has taken this command of not sharing in other people's sins and keeping yourself pure, and he's taken this to an extreme where, right, he's doing the right thing. He's trying to avoid every appearance of evil. He's trying to keep himself pure. He's trying to keep himself unspotted from the world, and one of his personal applications to sharing in other people's sins is, or defiling himself, is using some wine, even though for his physical condition he really needs to drink some wine so that he's not just drinking a bunch of diseased water that's not good and is giving him some major issues. He has decided to avoid using a little wine because he doesn't want to appear as defiled or appear as a drunkard or appear as anything like that. I think what Paul's telling him is, look, it's true, right? You should be careful. You need to not share in other people's sins. You need to keep yourself pure, but using a little wine is not defiling you, and it is okay to do that. That does not violate keeping yourself pure. It's okay to use some medicine sometimes. Not a ton, right? Don't get drunk. It's nothing like that. But this is something you need. Don't be afraid of doing that. I think if my reading and guess is correct, Timothy was probably so fixated on trying to keep himself pure that when Paul is writing this, keep yourself pure. By the way, Timothy, This means you are perfectly pure if you're using a little wine to try and help yourself not be physically ill. There's nothing evil about that. Again, this is not something that's like, go get drunk. Their wine was a lot less potent than ours is, and it would be mixed with water in most occasions. No longer drink water only, but use a little wine as well, would be the interpretation there. So I think that's what that is. And it is Timothy being a little bit too strict on the rule in verse 22, and Paul is saying, hey, you can lighten up a little bit. And one of the reasons he says that is because it's pretty clear when somebody is using the wine to do something evil. They'll be judged for that. But it's also pretty clear when somebody is using the wine because of physical illness, and that's not an issue. It's okay. Like, you don't want to defile yourself with picking an elder. You don't want to defile yourself in anything. But drinking a little bit of wine is not defiling yourself. Everybody who looks at you knows it. It's not, the command, right, for elders is to be blameless. In this case, Timothy wants to be blameless. And so he's keeping himself free of all kinds of grape juice flavored drink. But, like, is that technically more blameless than otherwise? Yes. But no one is actually going to blame you for drinking a little wine to help with your medical issues. Your sin, it's clear that your good works are what's driving you. No one's going to look at you put a tiny amount of alcohol in to purify the water and say, oh, that must be an evil guy. It's just not going to happen. Timothy, you can afford to lighten up a little bit. As much as these are very specific things and these are very important things, and you don't want to be condemned or impure from any point of view, you don't want those things, but you also don't have to be quite that strict. And I think that's what Paul's saying here at the end of chapter 5. Not really about widows, and it even branches off from the eldership discussion, but it is connected to the eldership discussion, which is why I think Paul goes there. Again, different people have different opinions, and it is just a kind of weird passage. So that's where we'll leave it for 1 Timothy 5. We'll go ahead and pause there. Next time, cover 1 Timothy 6. It's also a little bit of a shorter chapter, but there is still a decent amount of stuff to cover in terms of the ending as we're going. So I will see you next week. Thank you for listening if you're still here. I appreciate that. I hope that there's some amount of entertainment in there, but also that it's beneficial and it gives you something to think about. God bless, and I will see you at a future video, probably. If you're in this series, then I guess I'll probably see you next week for 1 Timothy chapter 6.